When you hear the word treasure, many of you will conjure up thoughts of Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, or you'll think of the Pirates of the Caribbean or Indiana Jones. The word treasure elicits excitement, but few of us, when we hear the word, actually think we have treasure. After all, I think the chances are slim to none that you guys have an old chest full of Spanish bullion at your house, right? Yet one proverb in our day goes like this: one man's trash is another man's. That saying exposes the fact that we as human beings not only have treasure, but we have and we treasure different things. Now, why is that? Well, certainly we're attracted to different items naturally, but why do we treasure things at all? Because we were created to treasure. We were created to treasure. We were created to find delight and joy and value and worth in something. We understand this concept pretty intimately, even if we may not have Spanish bullion or a treasure chest in our house. You see, in this church, there are unfortunately people who are Cubs fans, Yankees fans, and some of you have these things like Yankees caps. And you might even have a good Yankees cap, and you have this Yankees cap, and you might put it up, and you only get it out on special occasions, and you wear that cap, and you treasure it. Or you're a Cubs fan, and you still think 2016 was just yesterday, and you're just so grateful that they won the World Series after over 100 years, and you have a Cubs jersey up in your house, not only because you bought it, but because you want other people to see, I treasure the Cubs. Now for me, I think that stuff is garbage. I'm not a Yankees fan, I'm not a Cubs fan, I'm a Reds fan. So I don't value. I know, oh, yes, that's right. Oh, yeah. I don't value that stuff. We value different things. We also have this with music. Now, I know that we don't listen to CDs or tapes anymore. We listen to things on Spotify and iTunes, but humor me a bit, and let's go back 2 decades when people had CDs and tapes. Some of you would find great value in the best of Garth Brooks, while others of you would think that that's garbage, and you would think that your Rossini CD was of great value, yet others of you would say both of those are negative, don't like those, but I like my Abbey Road CD that I have. We value different things, but nevertheless, whether we value different things or value the same things, we were made to treasure. We put value to everything. We treasure different things because we were made to treasure. And in fact, because we were made to treasure, we live our lives striving to ascertain what we treasure. So what drives a professional athlete? They want to be the best at their sport. They want to win. They want to make money. They want fame. What drives the best musicians or what drives the top business leaders? It's much of the same. What we treasure drives how we live and what we live for. So I have to ask you this morning, what do you treasure? What do you want more than anything else? What drives you to get up in the morning, to go to work, to do hours of homework in school? What drives you to live? That's what you treasure. Some of you treasure stability or control or family, maybe God. Well, let's look in Matthew chapter 6 as we continue on in the Sermon on the Mount. We're going to see in Matthew chapter 6 that Jesus talks about treasure, and he talks about the fact that we are going to be living for some type of treasure. Our hearts are going to be attached to some type of treasure, and he asks what it is. This is Matthew chapter 6, and we're going to begin in verse 19. Matthew chapter 6, starting in verse 19. And one of the beautiful things is if you do not have a Bible, with our new chairs, we do have I know we don't have pews, but we have pew Bibles underneath every other chair. And so if you need a Bible, you can use that. Matthew chapter 6, starting in verse 19. This is the word of God. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. Friends, as we look at this text this morning, our big idea is this: what you treasure most is what you live for. What you treasure most is what you live for. This big idea drives the text that we're looking at this morning. And Jesus doesn't want you to know mere facts. That big idea is just a fact. What you treasure most is what you live for. But Jesus wasn't just teaching facts. He wants you to be changed by this fact. And Lord willing, preaching this morning, I want you to be changed by the fact of what you treasure is what you'll live for. Because at the end of the day, what Jesus was doing in the Sermon on the Mount is he was trying to cultivate kingdom people. He was trying to show people this is what it means to be a kingdom person, to be changed. And Jesus is after the hearts of people. And that's my job for you this morning, to ask you, what are you living for? What do you treasure most? And in order to do that, we're going to ask 3 questions of our text. And these questions are going to correspond to the various paragraphs in our section. So most of your Bibles, you'll have a paragraph in verses 19 through 21, and then verses 22 through 23, and then in verse 24. And those little sections are going to correspond to our questions. And the very first question we're going to ask is, where is your treasure? Where is your treasure? Jesus makes his greatest point in verse 21. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. That's what Jesus says. That's the hinge of this whole text. But in order to get there, Jesus asks, where is your treasure? It should be no surprise to us that Jesus is after our hearts. Jesus wants our hearts. He wants us to love him more than anything else. And we were made as people to treasure God above all else. But for all of human history, we have treasured everything and anything other than God above all else. So Jesus cuts to the heart, and he begins with the negative. He begins with, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth. Now, throughout the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus has used negative teaching to get his point across. And I think we need to understand this. Now, certainly, Jesus uses negative teaching and positive teaching. He uses negative reinforcement and positive reinforcement. But if you're like me, you've been on social media the last couple of years, you'll see lots of memes or different charts where people say, instead of saying this negative thing, use the positive, right? But Jesus is the ultimate teacher. And what we see is Jesus uses the negative for a reason. There are times to use negative teaching. There are times to use negative reinforcement. And I'm not trying to downplay encouragement. I'm not trying to downplay positivity. I think we need encouragement in life. We need more of it. But there are times where we need to just be blunt. We need to be negative to show people the absurdity of what they believe and what they live for. And so I'm not conveying, friends, for you to be a jerk when you do this. And I'm not conveying that you need to be mean to your preschool child when they give you the 1,000th piece of scribbled art and say, here you go. And go, that's awful, right? Like, I'm not saying that you need to do that. But there are times when we need to bluntly tell people, this is wrong. Don't do this. And Jesus does this well. And so what Jesus does is he urges the matter. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on this earth. Don't live for treasures on this earth. Why? Well, if you live for treasures on this earth, they will not satisfy you. In fact, they're corruptible. And this truth is true. It holds for Elon Musk all the way down to the poorest person during Jesus' day, that if you are building up for yourselves treasures on earth, they're not going to last. Why? Well, because moth and rust destroy and thieves steal. Now you have to remember, Jesus is talking to an ancient Near East people, and they didn't hold their wealth like you all hold your wealth. So many of you have 401ks, or you have investments or savings accounts, you have money. That's not how they dealt in wealth, most people back then. And they definitely didn't have 401ks. How they dealt in wealth was they would have a cloak. Clothes were expensive, coats were expensive, and so they would put their wealth in what they wore, and they would hand it down generation after generation. But you know what happens to cloaks? You know what happens to fabrics? Moths can eat those things. That's why if you've ever had the unfortunate experience of cleaning out a closet after a loved one dies, you might find some mothballs. You might find some gross things in there if coats or shirts or whatever else have been there for a long time. Moths can destroy clothing. They can destroy the wealth of these people. Not only that, but also rust destroys. And we see that this word rust actually means to eat away. So it could be the corrosive eating away of metals, or this word could also mean the eating away of like what vermin does. So mice and rats. So if you put yourself in the shoes of an ancient Near East person, they have their cloak, okay? They might have a few valuable items, a knife, a plow, but rust destroys those metals. Or they might have some crops, but vermin could eat the crops. And even what vermin could not eat or moths would not eat, thieves can come in and steal. And how much more so in our day and age, in which people can lose millions of dollars in the stock market, or fires and floods can take everything from you, or thieves can come in and steal in your homes or online through scams. But friends, some of us go, well, I have LifeLock. That's not going to happen. I have a great alarm system. My house will not burn. I'm not worried about moths destroying anything. I have a cat. There's no vermin that are going to come in. Even if you can keep your treasures for as long as humanly speaking on this earth, Jesus asked in Mark 8:36, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and yet forfeit his soul? You see, the reality is one day you are going to pass from life to death. You're going to pass from this life to the next one. And you cannot take 1 penny of your 401k. You can't take 1 cent of your savings account. You can't take with you your farms or your clothes or your cars or your businesses. History shows us that even the greatest empires of this earth do not last. So too, individual empires of personal wealth do not last. Sam Walton built a vast empire, and he left billions to his family. But what good did that do for Sam Walton? And to make my point, by the way, there are people sitting in this service right now who do not know who Sam Walton is. Now, let me give the caveat. There's nothing wrong with working hard. There's nothing wrong with making money. There's nothing wrong with making a lot of money. There's nothing wrong with leaving a legacy for your family. In fact, the book of Proverbs would tell you to do all those things. But if the focus of your life is building up treasure here on earth, you will have wasted your life. If your personal and central concern in life is living for the here and now and to hoard up treasures here on this earth, you are wasting the few precious moments that God has given you to walk on this earth. Now, Jesus moves to the positive. And so Jesus moves and he says, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But, now this is the positive, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. So as Jesus moves to the positive, now he's using the same incentives. So negatively, things can be destroyed, but positively, your treasure that's in heaven will not be destroyed ever. It's an eternal treasure. And Jesus moves on and asks in verse 21, and I said ask, and I know it's a statement, okay? He says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. But he's asking a question. Where is your treasure? What Jesus is teaching is that the lasting worth of your treasure depends on where your treasure is, and where your treasure depends, or where your treasure is, depends on what you treasure above all else. Now, if you're reading this passage and you realize, yes, I was made to treasure as a human being. I treasure things. I get that. And you shouldn't be building up treasures on earth, and you should be building up treasures on heaven. You need to ask the question, how do I build treasures up in heaven? Well, the answer to that question is in the rest of our text. And it all hinges on verse 21. So we'll be referring back to verse 21. But what we need to see, what you need to see, is that what you treasure more than anything else will tell you where your treasure is. So we're going to run a diagnostics here. We're going to determine where is your treasure. What do you treasure and where is your treasure? As we run this diagnostic evaluation, we're going to ask this question. What are you focused on? What are you focused on? So look at verse 22. The eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? Now this is an illustration that Jesus is using based off of what he just said. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Now to be sure, these two verses are kind of hard to understand. But what Jesus is after is for his audience to know the truth that you need to be focused on heavenly things, all right? So when we read the book of John or we read 1 John, we understand the idea is that light is good, darkness is bad, and so too is the case here in Matthew. That when Jesus is saying eyes are full of light, that's a good thing. That's the eyes that are focused on heaven. And when your eyes are full of darkness, it's focused on evil things, okay? Now, an unhealthy eye, we know, is a serious thing. Some of you are more or less blind. I know if you were to look at my prescription and how thick my glasses are, you would go, ooh, that brother is very blind. And even more so during this time of year. I don't know about you, but I hate this time of year because of allergies. It's really pretty. I'm glad everything's getting warmer. I thank the God for that weather. But when I see the yellow stuff on my car outside, it is bad news bears for me. A couple of years ago, I had a doctor, an eye doctor, who was like, man, you keep getting pink eye, not because it's gross, like not because you're doing gross stuff, but because of your allergies. He goes, you need to use these eye drops during allergy season. And so I started using them. And what a difference that can make when your eyes actually aren't red and itchy and have gunk in them all the time. Wonderful picture, I know. But wow, just little drops, boom, boom. And my eyes feel great, and I feel better. Well, this is the illustration that Jesus is making. That when our eyes are focused on the heavenly things, when we are focused on Christ, when we're focused on God and honoring God, we are healthy. But when we're focused on the allurement of this earth, when we're focused on earthly things, when we're focused on evil, our whole lives are being wasted. In fact, not even just wasted, They're in darkness. They're evil. Now, how does this play out? We could apply this in a lot of different ways, but let's apply it to greed. Jesus is talking about treasure here after all. And even though I do think that he's talking more than just physical money or material assets, he's not talking about less. And so if we think about greed in the context of gaining more and more material wealth, we have to see what Jesus is saying is so true. You see, it's possible for greed to force all the other good out of somebody, that their main focus in life is indescribable darkness. You see, they can't see that they're not living for God. Now, I'll give you the illustration that there are people who can look really bad. And you go, I don't even know if they're a Christian, and yet they can be a Christian, right? There can be somebody who makes millions upon millions of dollars, and you go, man, I don't know if they're really a Christian, and they can be a Christian. But so too is the case that there can be people here at Aboy Baptist Church who come in every Sunday, who do the Christian thing every single Sunday, and they look good on the outside. They give 10% of their money. And yet they're still greedy. They're still living for the things of this earth. And that's really scary. That just because you're here doesn't mean that you don't have an idol of greed. It doesn't mean that your eyes are focused on heaven. I know people who have been both inside this church and outside this church who have claimed Christ, and they go to church consistently. They do the church thing, and they even give 10% of everything they make. But their heart's nowhere near the Lord. They aren't living to build up treasures in heaven. They're building treasures here on earth. And you say, how do you know that? Well, their own mouths give it away. Because every time you talk to them, they're talking about material wealth. It's always about business or their hobbies. But when they speak about the church, it's in a way that they're just checking off boxes. And they lack great affection for God and his people. They believe that the Bible tells them they must give 10%, and because they want to be good, they want to check that box, they give 10%, but don't ask them to ever give more. Don't ask them to be a cheerful giver. Don't ask them to be a gracious giver, to give above and beyond. They know nothing of that. Greed has swept them away, and all they are living for is their little empire here on earth that does not last. Friends, greed can never build eternal treasure. Only God can do that. Again, there is nothing wrong with having money. But what is your main goal in life? Are you working so hard to achieve a certain lifestyle, and you're focused solely on that you've forgotten Christ? You've forgotten his people? Friends, there are great Christian people who make lots of money. Various amounts. And instead of building up treasure here on earth, they build up treasures in heaven. And they are gracious givers. And they give, and they give. And because God says in his word he can never be outgiven, he gives them more. It doesn't matter how much you have. It doesn't matter if you have $10 or $100 million. What are you focused on? Where is your treasure? That's where your heart will be. The second diagnostic question that Jesus asked is, who do you serve? Who do you serve? So picking up in verse 24. No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. If you want to know if you're building up earthly treasure or heavenly treasure, you have to ask, who do you serve? And the reality is you cannot live wholeheartedly for God and for something else. You just can't do that. Those who live for multiple pursuits know this. Now, Jesus uses the language that these people would have been very familiar with, slave and master. But I can venture to say, probably none of you have ever been a slave. But I think we understand this idea of a torn affection. Because How many of us, and probably most of us, all of us, have been in this situation before, where you have a mom and a dad, and the mom says, you need to do this, and a dad says, you need to do this, and you are the child, and you're stuck in the middle. And what do we do? What do we do when the mom says, clean your room and dust your room, and your dad says, hey, I want you to go on a walk with me? Well, generally speaking, we do what we want to do, right? And here's the commands of God who says, live for me. And that's hard. That's not tangible. It's not like God is just present right here, and he is present, but physically, like just right here. And we know ourselves, and we know our own inclinations, and so we want to live and please ourselves more than we want to live and please God. Have you ever been in a situation with a boss? Maybe you have two managers in your company, and one says, do this, the other one says, do that. What do? You're torn, your affections are torn. And if you try to please both of them, you can't. Well, the same principle applies here. You can only serve one master. Some of you are trying to serve two masters. You know Christ, and you're a Christian, but you're miserable. You're miserable. And you think sometimes, man, if I wasn't a Christian, life would be easier. Because you see what the world has, and it's alluring. I want that boat. I want that car. I want those clothes. I just don't want to care so much, but because I'm a Christian, I have to care. And so your stomach's in knots because you're trying to live for two masters. Here is the reality we need to see. Jesus says in verse 24, you cannot serve God and money. You can't do it. Now, Jesus is talking about material wealth, but he's not only talking about that. Because we can treasure a whole slew of things. And if you want to know what somebody treasures, follow their money, right? I know some of you are Cubs fans and Yankees fans. You would not catch me spending any money on that stuff, right? It's because I don't value it, I don't treasure it. Well, money can be an idol for sure. But money can also expose other idols in our lives. Let's think about a few of them. What about comfort? When you spend money on new cars, new sheets for your bed, Amazon Prime, it could reveal that your treasure is comfort more than anything else. Now, I want you to notice, there is nothing wrong with a new car. There is nothing wrong with new sheets. There is nothing wrong with having Amazon Prime. In fact, at various points in my life, I have bought a new car, I've gotten new sheets for my bed, and I subscribe to Amazon Prime. It's very convenient. But why do you do those things? Are you living for the God of comfort? If someone were to approach you and say, you know what, we have a missionary who needs some extra help. And you look at your finances and you go, if I were to get rid of Amazon Prime for a month, for 2 months, I could help them. Or if I hold off on buying that car as opposed to another car, I would have a few extra $1,000s to give them. Would that prick your soul, and would you get sick thinking about that? Or would you go, that's a no-brainer. Let me do that. What about image? Some people spend their money on clothes and makeup and cowboy boots. And their idol's not money, but they want to be thought of in a certain way. They want to be seen as stylish or an it person. There's nothing wrong with clothes. You all are wearing clothes. Thank you. There's nothing wrong with makeup. There's nothing wrong with cowboy boots, which, by the way, if you don't know, that's what I wear all the time. But why do you spend money on those things? What about children? Do you spend money on their education, on their sports, on music lessons, clothes? Do you find your worth in the success of your children? If you are living just for your children, you're trying to build up treasures here on earth. And again, we should love our kids. We should care about their education, and we should want them to maximize their talents in sports and in music and in everything else. But if we're living for our children, we're building up treasures here on this earth and not in heaven. Now, I see a lot of this, what I just mentioned, in our part of town. If you're not from Fort Wayne, if you're new, this side of town has some wealth. And people live for all of these things. And maybe money isn't their idol, but images or comfort is, or their children are. And as I look around at this church, I would say for the most part, in my observations at least, we do a pretty good job of trying to not do that. But I do think in our church, we can fall into the different trap. Instead of spending money, not spending money, which can show us that we have an idol of security and control. And it's funny how God works. Because as I was studying this text, I was confronted with this same idol in my own heart of security and control by not spending money because I need a new roof. I had some roofers come over. I got a pretty good price on a roof. I put a down payment on a roof, and then I was sick to my stomach for the next day and a half because unfortunately roofs are not cheap. And I wrote that check, and I was thinking, man, what if I need that? And then I had to stop and go, you know what, Lord? You have been so faithful in providing for my family so that we can have a roof over our heads. And we need a roof over our heads. Thank you, Lord, for that. Friends, whether it's security or image or children or money, we can have idols in this life when we can begin to serve those masters and not God. And we can raise for ourselves these empires here on earth that will not last. And Jesus says in verse 21, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And you can say, what's the big deal about trying to do these things or have these idols? It's not sinful to love your children. It's not sinful to have new clothes. It's not no, it's not. But if we're living for those things, what's at stake is our heart. You see, chapter 6 is inherently connected to each other. Now, some people look at verses 19 through the end of the chapter and they say, that's a section, and then they say the section before is a section. But this all goes together. Because when we talk about fasting, what Jesus is asking is, do you love God more than the necessities of life, more than food? And in prayer, do you love God more than just thinking through? And are you willing to submit your will and what you want to his will and what he wants for your life? And he's talked about money a couple times. Because Matthew preached a couple Sundays ago about giving. Do you love God more than your money? Friends, if we treasure anything equal to or more than God, it's an idol. Our hearts are lost. We're living in darkness. But what Jesus calls us to is something so much better. Because in the negative, he also speaks of the positive. Build up for yourselves treasures in heaven. We sang the song, In Emmanuel's Land. It was written in part by a guy named Samuel Rutherford. His dying words were that he was beholding the glory of God in heaven. The treasure trove of heaven is so much greater than anything that we could ever think about on earth, ever comprehend on earth. And Jesus says, build up for yourselves treasures in heaven. Live for eternity rather than just now. And Pastor John Piper asked this question as it relates to treasure, as it relates to our eternal state. He said this, the critical question for our generation and for every generation is this. If you could have heaven with no sickness and with all the friends you ever had on earth and all the food you ever liked, and all the leisure activities you ever enjoyed, and all the natural beauties you ever saw, all the physical pleasures you ever tasted, and no human conflict or any natural disasters, could you be satisfied with heaven if Christ were not there? Friends, anything other than treasuring Christ above all else is building for yourself something here on earth that will not last. But Christ is the ultimate treasure who will not fade, who we can live in his presence forever and ever. And he says, desire me, desire my Father, desire heaven more than anything in this earth. What do you treasure most? Because it's what you live for.